Welcome everybody. It's really great to see such a wide variety of people here. We've got diplomats, we've got a wide variety of British government officials, we've got military people, we've got people from business, we've got the odd lawyer, we've got the odd journalist, and we've got academics. And also we've got an audience whose average age is lower than you might usually have at an ISS event. So that's really great, because this is a really important topic. Now, it's a topic that forced itself on the consciousness of Western security and defence communities with Russia's malign activity in Crimea and eastern Ukraine in 2014, and also the rise of Daesh, this pseudo-state insurgent and terrorist organisation that seriously upset the strategic balance in the Middle East, a topic that Linda's done a lot of excellent work on. And of course we also see Western governments and governments in the region being extremely concerned by activity by China in the South and East China Sea, and a general sense that the rules-based international order is under threat, including from malign actors. For example, Iran's activity in its near abroad is seen as deeply destabilising by Saudi Arabia, the UAE and their allies. Now, Linda's comes to us from the RAND Corporation head office in Washington, D.C. And Linda has for some time been doing really excellent work in this area. And the thing of hers that really caught my eye a few years ago was an excellent short, sharp report called Improving Strategic Competence. Now, behind that is a really good summary of the difficulties that the United States had running their wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and 7 clear prescriptions on how the US government could do better. Now, Linda's also done a lot of work on the area of special operations and special operations forces. But I think modern political warfare is excellent. It's a really good piece of work. It provides a really good look at the problem, but it's not just admiring the problem. It identifies where the problem's being tackled, who's tackling it, and what good ideas and good practice there is around. So, Linda, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ben. It's really such a pleasure to be here, and I thank you for that introduction. And particularly, I've known Ben, Brigadier Barry, for many years, and those comments about the strategic competence study, or our attempt to do lessons of then it was 13 years of war, and this study I think do represent my broadest strategic analysis efforts, and so I do hope they have a quality that will endure beyond the year in which they're published. And I know the study of 2013 received quite a good reception here, and you were kind enough to host me then, as well as some other audiences in town. So what I would like to do, and I do believe it's one of the wonderful things about IISS is the talent that's gathered here at lunchtime, and so I am going to go, I hope, just very quickly through the high points of this study, which is very long. It's online for a free download. It tops out at 355 pages, so you might dip in and out on the chapters that interest you, and you can treat this, I think we're going to post the slides online here, so you can treat this presentation as kind of the cliff notes for what you might be interested in. One other note I would like to make is that RAND, even though its name is RAND Corporation, it is a nonprofit and nonpartisan research institution. We do a lot of government-sponsored research, but we do research for any entity, and we have a very rigorous peer review quality assurance process, and those standards are online. So that is what we hope lends credibility and rigor to our products and our reputation. So this study, we'll start with the title, Modern Political Warfare, and I'll give you a bit of the etymology of it. and it did begin 3 years ago. So the process of doing the research, the writing, the peer review, we've begun some spiral development on aspects in the meantime, but it was published this spring. That's about the average time when a RAND product pops out. In that time, of course, there's been a lot of development and discussion around this topic, but I will offer you what I think our highlights are. So my overview here of the questions are: is political warfare a thing? Does it even exist? Is it a threat currently? We approach it through a case study, very deep case studies on 3 entities, the premise being states as well as empowered non-state actors may practice this form of warfare or disruption. We then collect up what we think are key attributes. We identify some of the difficulties in getting our arms around it, and then have some specific prescriptions. And I would very much like you to contest and respond to any of these points. The definition really does come from George Kennan in the Cold War and a speech he gave at our National Defense University, as well as elaborated in many of his writings. And it really is, the other stock phrase is measures short of war. War understood as conventional, traditional combat. So to the left of that, if you're thinking schematically, it's a series of activities across the diplomatic, political, informational space, military and intelligence, and economic, financial. And that will be kind of our organizing construct for going through this. You may say, well, this is just normal statecraft. And indeed, many of these practices individually can be absolutely benign statecraft measures. It's the combination that has effect, and it's also the more either transgressive for the adversary or more ambitious or offensive for the defender. So without going into great detail here, we can parse what we're talking about, if you like, either through specific examples or question and answer. To summarize again, we're focused on the non-combat military activities, and very heavily on non-military activities, because a lot of times when people think about warfare, they think about what are militaries doing. And in fact, a great deal of the activity, the quantity as well as the impact of the activity, is in the other 3 spheres, the D, the I, and the E. So I will quickly summarize the case studies. We did look at corporate practices that might fall into this realm. Our peer reviewers objected because they thought it was a red herring, and many people said, why didn't you do China? And we certainly could have done China. So what I'll summarize for you here are the practices that we observed, and the underpinning theoretically or doctrinally that was the organizing principle for these actors. This is too small to read, so I will just give you the highlights of what we found that was interesting as we surveyed the range of activities. And a very important first point about Russia is that it's motivated by a sense that it's under attack from the West. So that's, I think, the psychological stance is very important to keep in mind. And whatever the truth, some people may view them as the aggressor, some may view them as the attack, but this is their mental framework. And specifically, they see the democracy promotion activities and a free press as particularly threatening activities. We did a sub-case study on Estonia and the Bronze Soldier incident that some of you who work in this area may be familiar with, and this was really illustrated the opportunistic approach that Russia took with the Russian national population that lives there, and controversies around history and the rights and status of that population. Russia had been feeding in, stoking, if you will, some of these fissures in the society, and then at the moment of the crisis capitalized on it, and its activities included the denial of service attack and moving into the cybersphere. And this is what really distinguishes this form of activity from the Cold War era. We did a historical chapter looking at how this was practiced in the Cold War, but of course, cyber and information techniques and capabilities have really expanded and supercharged this activity. A couple other points with regard to Russia. As I just said, they have innovated in the economic sphere, the media sphere, cyber sphere, and what we call social proxies. And the famous Night Wolves is an example of that, but using NGOs that may not be armed per se, but they do go in and foment some of the divisions and create a platform. And then finally, Russia propaganda. This is, I think, important to see how they, another colleague of mine calls it a fire hose of falsehood. This is Chris Paul's term, and it's a nice study if you want to download it. But the idea is they're oftentimes not looking so much to persuade as to obfuscate. And this is may lead some people to say, well, therefore it's not effective. But if you actually are just creating questions around any assertion, that can have a very powerful effect of its own. Now, Iran is a very interesting actor, and I would, although it's called out in our national security strategy released earlier this year, as well as the national defense strategy, I think it's very important not to treat them all as apples. They're apples and oranges. I believe Iran is primarily seeking regional influence. It does have activities abroad, but how it operates, and it has a very highly developed form. It calls it soft power, based on its cultural, political, and religious influence. And the main limiting factor that we ask is how far can these tools of influence extend? They are a Persian and Muslim country, but the limitations are transcended because it has a differentiated approach, whether the target audience is Shia, Arab, non-Arab, and it does play to its pan-Islamic audience through cultural institutes that you can find in many countries around the world. So it's got a we often think, when we think of Iran, we think of Hezbollah, and we think of Hezbollah with its military power projection. But that is really just one element. And I've spent many years, since 2003 actually, in Iraq and watched their influence building and their development, not just of militias. The militias now have spawned in political parties, they're members of parliament, they have influence, and they're not really even proxies or semi-proxies. I would argue these entities are now part of the political environment of Iraq and will be contended with going forward. And in Syria, we've seen, obviously, the use of Arab proxy forces to get over the language gap and just to extend its power. So it's really, I think, a very interesting phenomenon. The case study of the Islamic State, I'll be even more brief, and we can talk about that in some depth, but I think it's very important to think about what a quasi-state or super-empowered non-state actor might be able to do in this realm. In the case of ISIS, they actually appropriated many tools of state power, and they also developed state-like capabilities in the administrative and financial taxation realm. They ran the economic resources of the areas they controlled. They imported and created or simply co-opted the necessary technical expertise that they did not possess. And of course, they had a very unique brand, one of their foundational documents, The Management of Savagery, the very deliberate approach to the use of violence, not only to control, but actually to recruit. And this is one of, I think, the novel things about how they view propaganda. And then, of course, it's quite, I think, well documented by now, their leveraging of social media, open media as well as encrypted apps to conduct a range of operations, from recruitment, inspiring, planning, and executing their operations. And I've done a lot of battlefield assessment of their TTPs, and I believe, while some people are saying, well, they were dismantled, Well, they persisted for quite a while, and they're pretty seamlessly moving back to insurgent mode. So I, for one, do not count them out. What I would like to do now is just summarize quickly what this phenomenon is. And again, I welcome challenges to this, but as we tried to look across these cases, we saw, first of all, the diversity of tools being used across this Steinfeld spectrum, the heavy reliance on unattributed forces and unattributed means. The importance of the information arena, very critical, and the winner is, it's more a question of how many likes do you have than are you actually right. So we're in this world of, I would say, semi-relativism with regard to who the winner is. Economic leverage is very much a hallmark of this through lending, funding of campaigns, creating shell companies. So there is outright economic leverage, and then there's more concealed leverage. The key, perhaps, point here, which countries are vulnerable and not? Certainly if they have a shared basis, or in the case of Russia, the near abroad, those are going to be seen as their defensive perimeter and areas where they have a history and a population to exploit. But also increasingly, and this came into sharp relief, I think, with the U.S. election campaign, the exploitation of seam issues, divisions in the population. And then finally, this is something that doesn't replace traditional warfare. It may, on the one hand, be seen as a precursor to a softening or preparation of the battlefield for traditional aggression, but I think more than anything, it's a way of war. It is a way of achieving objectives without having to incur the cost of traditional combat. We believe it is on the rise. We see the conditions around the world as lending the defenses are down, and so this can be prosecuted more easily. So quickly on the difficulties of getting our arms around it. Its nature is ambiguous, and it is not going to be easily detected at the early stages. And as I said at the outset, many of these practices are in fact normal tools of statecraft augmented by other measures. So in the intelligence community is looking for indicators and warnings. And so it can be very difficult to determine what is the threshold, when is it beginning, when is it getting traction, and when is it on a threshold where you would want a policymaker to stand up and take notice. So we are trying to develop some approaches to this that not just track the adversary's activities along these multifaceted vectors over time, which is very critical. This is a slow burn type of activity. So over time and by category, and then a critical factor, where are the country vulnerabilities and are they being exploited, and do we see those vulnerabilities growing over time? So what should be done? And this, I hope we can have a real free-for-all here. The U.S. is certainly recapitalizing and trying to enhance its deterrence against high-end warfare. There's a large bill for modernization of the nuclear triad and so forth. So budget-wise, certainly the weight is going to what is considered the most dangerous course of action, which is that type of warfare. But the ubiquity of this type of warfare, and we can go through the lexicon of terms that have been developed. I'm not necessarily wedded to political warfare. It's more important to me that people have this dialogue around what is happening at this lower end of the spectrum. And so I would argue that it's cheaper to confront and contest it at the lower end. And without contestation, adversaries have a greater chance of achieving their goals without ever having to resort to warfare. And then how we do it, how do governments do it? This is, I think, an open question. I'll propose one model based on what Kenan had suggested, but I would submit it's a governmental issue, it's an issue for allies, and very importantly, it's an issue for societies. as I will argue with regard especially to the information realm. Again, too many words on this slide. The idea here is you have to have a strategy, and I think there's a large degree of consensus around the need to defend an international rules-based order. What those rules are and what the order is will have to evolve to incorporate changes in the balance of power and incorporate, in my view, the rise of China, but within a rules-based system. The integrated whole-of-government approach, and I would like to hear from anyone here who has opinions about the UK's fusion doctrine. It's really, I think, a similar idea of trying to get all the branches of government with their respective competencies together. I add another idea, which is really the country under attack in many cases is not the U.S. It's a matter then of allowing that country under attack to express its preferences and let them take the lead, and for the U.S. to perform the supporting role. And then our report goes through a lot of gaps, both the requirements and the gaps for the U.S. to actually perform this role. I want to end with just a couple of comments about the importance of this the information and the cyber realm. And this is where I think the societal role and the individual role is essential. And it's not something that can be replaced, done by government or imposed by government. To some degree, government may set a structure for the tech companies. I think we're in a sea change right now with regard to our social media tech companies, because they've always alleged that they are simply a platform. They're not content creators. They have no responsibility to be a gatekeeper for content. And as we've seen through multiple hearings in multiple countries, and of course I think Europe is a little bit ahead on this front, they have responsibilities to, I think, help clean up what I call contaminated information environment. And not just contaminated by aggressors, contaminated by the absolute free-for-all based on really a business model that monetizes everything, has no standards, and does not encourage any kind of deliberate choice on the part of the consumer. In fact, the opposite. The curatorial algorithms used really keep feeding the same, perhaps false notions that you're getting in your daily diet of choice. And then cyber, I think the same thing applies. There is a government role for detection and exposure of attackers, but private sector, I think, has many tools and many capabilities. User hygiene, you have to know how to keep your own cyber systems clean, and I think there are a lot of people with poor practices. I'll just say one name, John Podesta. You got to take care of your own information with the tools that are provided. And then in extremis, computer network operations, offensive operations may be needed in extremis. But I think, there's a whole ladder of menus going on the offense here. We need to be deliberate about it, and I'm not in any way advocating that we use the same dirty tricks used in the Cold War or the nefarious practices used by the adversary, because then we really lose the moral advantage. However, I think we are inert in some critical realms of this contest now.
Linda, well, thank you very much. That's commendably clear and concise. Can I pose the first question? If you were doing this now, what do you think you'd say about China?
So I think that China is a critical and important case, and I would compare it perhaps with the profile of Russia. Russia is not the Soviet Union. Russia has a very small GDP relatively. It has, I think, many internal problems. It's a brittle state with, I think, a personalistic regime not founded. Frankly, I wonder what's underneath the Putin charisma and where it will go post-Putin. But it's really punching above its weight. It's an opportunistic actor right now, willing to take risks with the relatively small advantages and tools that it has. China is the opposite end of the spectrum. There is no stopping the rise of China, and I think while we can and I think should be very clear in drawing lines for Russia Russia, I think a cooperative approach with China is essential to get them into whatever reformed international rules-based system there is. And they have a great power to do good. I am not one of those. I actually lamented when the previous administration announced its pivot to Asia from the Defense Department, because I think the message should be, while there are clearly some transgressive activities, mostly involving extent of sovereignty through air and sea, the South China Sea, the ADIZ zone, there are practices of property theft and so forth that must be dealt with quite clearly. I think that China could be a very important partner for the future, so I would like to see a nuanced approach to that. Robert Blackwell wrote a very good book outlining the economic warfare practices of China. There's been more recent work as well. I think many think tanks, and I know there's some experts in the audience here, I think China is an important actor to include.
Right, well, can we throw the floor open? I'm sure there's quite a few questions and comments people want to have. If you can catch my eye. Yeah. When you ask a question, could you identify yourself and the organisation you come from?
So now I'm at the moment visiting fellow at ISS, but earlier I was India's ambassador to the US. And just wanted to understand in terms of what is specifically new in what you're saying, because at one level political warfare is something that has gone on all the time. And the US and countries in Europe have themselves conducted political warfare against the others. So is what you're trying to say that the technology that is now being used in political warfare and therefore evolved because of digital and cyber, and that is the dimension that one should also look at? And is the specific purpose of your study aimed at US and European policymakers, that they face certain challenges related to political warfare, and how should they adapt to that, rather than an overall analytical study of the subject of political warfare? So that was it.
Thank you very much. Very thoughtful comments and questions, and I would like to respond with three, I think, very important points. The U.S. had many more tools and much more embrace during the Cold War of this phenomenon, political warfare, and please feel free to substitute your favorite term. Again, there are about 16 different terms out there. And for example, we no longer have, very critically, the U.S. Information Agency. So even tools that we once had, we no longer have. And what's new about the practice of political warfare are the power and means of information and cyber. So it's an attempt to update and remind U.S. audiences that it is an important phenomenon, especially at a time when the U.S. defense institution is kind of looking at high-end warfare. It's like, look at how these actors, whether they're the revisionist powers or the rogue states like Iran, which is how we branded in our policy Iran, look at how they're behaving now. While you have to prepare for conventional warfare, they're actually conducting this now. So it's a clarion call really to the U.S. and the U.S. public to embrace this, not to declare war, but to defend the measures that are being taken to undermine. In regards to Europe and NATO, there has been, now there's a hybrid center of excellence. There are beginning measures, the entire Enhanced Forward Presence. When we began this, we held a conference out in Cambridge called Measures Short of War, and only those countries who felt directly under attack attended the conference. 3 years later, there's much greater consensus about the need to do something. However, there is still a difference, as we're seeing right now, I think, in how to handle the Kerch Strait incident. And I think this is where we're now getting into the details of what is an effective response. And I would just point out that the measures taken thus far to respond, sanctions against infringement of sovereignty, expansion of territorial claims and so forth, and interference in elections, the measures taken haven't stopped the egregious activities. So I think the message here is it's not mission accomplished.
Thanks. Josh Arnold Foster.
Hi, Josh Arnold Foster. previously briefly in Wimbledon. The really interesting paper, I haven't finished it yet, but one of the areas that I think is challenging, certainly for the UK, is where we engage with the private sector over this issue, because you hinted at it with the tech companies, this argument, this ongoing argument about, they're just a platform now. And so, the debate about regulation, where I think the smart people in the tech companies realise the question of regulation, government regulation, is a question of when, not if. So I think there is movement there, but more broadly, it's understanding how both our adversaries are using economic warfare. What are their companies doing, whether they are state companies or notionally private companies, their investment patterns, their investment both in, just in physical assets, but investment in IPR, which is really one of those areas, particularly with the Chinese, what they are doing in the software industry is a really interesting area. But what we don't get, certainly in the UK, is a coherent message from government. If you look at how we have handled issues like Huawei's investment with BT, or winning of contracts with BT, or the current debate about Chinese investment in nuclear power stations, or some of the issues surrounding Gazprom, what it's doing, we don't see, what I would be interested in is how does the US deal with this? How does the US handle those economic issues? Because you do have a more directive system of governance, as far as I can see. So you can, you do make it plain to big US companies what they can and can't do. We don't seem to have that same consensus in this country. And is there do you have any lessons for it?
That's a really useful question.
Yes, it's useful and complicated, and you've raised many aspects of it. So I will just, in the interest of contributing some thoughts here, I think the U.S. does prefer free enterprise to forge ahead. So the default position isn't let's regulate it, but I believe that we are, as you acknowledge, we're heading down the road, I think, to some kinds of stipulations being put into law. Of course, this is, the FANGs, the companies in charge of this, immensely wealthy companies, most of them appeared to testify over the course of the year, and very much the message was, we understand, we're sorry, we're getting after it, we're taking care of it, but they've shifted, I think, now into full-on lobby mode to help craft what is coming. I think that it's not possible for them to probably entirely police themselves. I do think it's a good idea for them to come up with the right types of approaches, but I would note at the fundamental, their business model is just fundamentally about sucking up everything, keeping everything forever, and monetizing everything. So there is a real, I think, tension at the heart of it, and I think these companies are going to have to come around. As a former journalist, this is probably shapes my view to really understanding some of the same responsibilities that our mainstream media, the respected media, has over time embraced, practiced, and been recognized for. Now we live in a different era. I realize you can't just transplant that model and stick it on top of it. Just briefly, though, you also raised technological change, the 5G race, the idea there may be separate systems, money going into corporations. The U.S. is leaning forward on CFIUS changes, so what countries can buy what U.S. companies, and what kind of process there is to make sure this isn't some kind of Trojan horse. There are just multitude of issues about money flows and what people can do in tech companies if they are wholly owned subsidiaries of a government with an intention to undermine.
Thanks. There's a gentleman on the left, just off from the aisle.
Hello, so my name is Alan Svensson. I'm an intelligence analyst and look at strategic futures. Apologies if my question is a bit technical. I'm just curious to know why you use the DIME framework for your sort of indicators, if you like, systems of systems, rather than, say, compared to something like PEMESI or the PESTEL type of approach, which you could argue cover sort of different broader areas, or whether if you did a comparison between those different types, whether they'd flag up different things.
Okay, can I just intervene here? I think there are some people in the audience who might be grateful for a bit of jargon decoding. So let me start. DIME is a term invented by the US, which is diplomacy, information, military and economic, to describe the tool set you might use to handle a strategic problem. Linda, you introduced DIME Phil, which probably not everybody has had a chance to Google.
Which adds finance, intelligence, and law enforcement. And PEMESI, do you want to recite the PEMESI?
Yeah, you posed the question, you decode the jargon.
Which I...
Political military, economic, social, informational, stroke intelligence, structural, and PESTLE, sort of similar, political, economic, social, technical, legal, legislative, and environmental.
Okay, I'm sure there's some in the audience who'll forgive me for jumping in there.
They're all systems of systems.
Yes, so, and we have, I just will give a rather simplistic answer, and we can talk more about this, but really if you break down the categories, and what we did was we started with DIME or DIME-FIL, but then as we developed our analytic system, we have binned them, and especially because the social movements and social cohesion is a very important factor. So I would just, we have covered all the buckets. It's just that I guess in the U.S., DIME is a more widely propagated acronym. Although I have to say, I am the worst offender of acronym speak, and so perhaps we should all just default to the common English language.
Okay, gentleman in the second row of the left. There's a microphone coming.
Yeah, I am Jalil Jirani, and I am a visiting fellow of Pakistan. Earlier, I also served as ambassador of Pakistan to Washington, D.C. You mentioned about the desirability of having a cooperative approach vis-a-vis China, but why can't we have the same approach vis-a-vis Iran and Russia? I say this because as ambassador of Pakistan, I also looked after Iranian interests in Washington, D.C., and when you spoke to the Iranians, they would also express the same kind of concerns with regard to elements which were being employed against Iran in terms of social, political warfare that you mentioned in the context of Iran, in terms of directly employing certain tools by the U.S. to destabilize Iran, as well as encouraging its allies in the Middle East to destabilize Iran.
Good question. Thank
you. Wonderful question, and I thank both of you for being here. It's so it's an honor to have you participate, and I think that perhaps I don't mean to single out China as the only country with which we should cooperate, and I will again, since my baseline here has been the Cold War. Even at the height of our tensions with the Soviet Union, there were always arms control measures, talks, attempts to reach agreements, and absolutely any country that would be willing to agree not to carry out, to refrain from certain practices that the international community agrees are either against international law or clearly disrupting the international order, that I think is how the road to resolution occurs. I mean, if there is and I do think that we have a particular issue with Russia, and really kind of an extraordinary case of annexation of territory that has, again, it's a fait accompli now, right? Even with sanctions gone on these many years, and with the bridge being built, and now the Kerch Straits, it's just, I think we have a very severe problem with Russia. That said, I've actually just collaborated in a Track 2 event with a Russia think tank and U.S. think tank, and tried to work out what areas in Syria, what points of action in Syria might help unwind that very troubling and egregious situation. And Russia's position of influence and power there, whether you like it or not, it makes it a player in that. So I just throw that out as an example. In the case of Iran, I think that I'm not here to sort of defend U.S. government actions, but obviously there was an attempt in an international agreement to curb development of nuclear weapons capability. I personally think that was a good road to go down, but the unaddressed threat was destabilizing other countries. And I will guarantee you Iraq does not want to be destabilized by Iran. It does not want to be the 51st state of Iran. So I think there is a need to engage with Iran to see what agreements for its regional behavior might be reached. And the Secretary of State has said that he believes and hopes Iran will come around to a dialogue. I'm not sure if I would endorse all the methods being used, but we also really have right now largely a hortatory policy beyond sanctions.
Gentleman at the back.
Good afternoon. I'm Major Arun Chauhan from the Indian Army. I'm a student here at LSE. My question is, as an infantryman, where does the mainstream military fit in? Wherein I'm not seeking my relevance or utility, but how can I contribute? Or the mainstream military can contribute in this political warfare?
Yes, good. Thank you. Actually, that's a great question because I skipped over in my urge to get quickly to conversation. So the types of things, and I think very heavily, exposing bad acts, I think is incredibly important. So that's why I put that first in my list. And escalation ladder may not be the correct term because that implies kind of a sequential order. You can do many things at once, and it also implies kind of an inevitability and escalating upward, and that certainly would not be, I'm not saying go, I am saying we could be more proactive in taking measures to restrain these activities, and I think some early action would forestall the need for considering more dramatic actions. What is happening right now with regard to posture and exercises is extremely important, both in the maritime realm, the freedom of navigation patrols, forward presence in Europe, the exercises that NATO just recently completed Trident Juncture, the largest exercise in 50 years at least, a gigantic exercise. These are very important. They're very important signaling activities, and they're also, frankly, preparations in case another country is infringed upon by, in this case, Russia, but by any country. The Article 5 provisions need to be clearly seen as effective, the will of NATO. And I recognize NATO has been stretched. It has to look out for its core countries. It's upped its commitment in Afghanistan, and it has, as I hope all of you know, made a commitment now for training in Iraq, which I think is incredibly important, and very important that it have the NATO flag on it. Then finally, there are small advisory efforts to specific countries, always invited in, but there are certain capabilities that countries have, and I always like to point out the police training capability of countries like Canada, Australia, and so forth. I'm not just talking about U.S. countries. I think the ability to help other countries in across the realm of these defensive activities is very important, but at the invitation of and according to the plan of that country.
Thanks. Dame Glyn Evans, just on the other side of the aisle at the back.
Thank you very much. Glyn Evans, I'm an advisor to a number of companies in security space, including cyber. I think in this fascinating presentation, what struck me, first a couple of comments. In your outlining what the Iranians are doing, it sounded to someone of my generation awfully like what used to happen under the Soviet Union and the Communist Party playbook, and they're using that around the world. Secondly, what is happening in terms of cyber war, not least by the Iranians, is affecting a great many countries we're not talking about. The Iranians are seeking to destabilize Gulf countries by attacking their cyber. Anyone who works in the cybersecurity space is finding plans coming from all over the world. And it's not just state activities, it's also criminal activities. Attacks on central banks are not uncommon around the place. And it seems to me we're coming back to a sort of area that everyone remembers a sort of book by Peter Calvo-Caresi called Total War. This is very hydra-headed. It's coming at us from all directions and not just the key actors. And I wanted to suggest something that may be extremely naive. In addition to all these military, diplomatic, intelligence, etc., is there not a case for bringing in cohorts of volunteers, the silver surfers who have some pretty good IT skills and a certain amount of capacity? When you look at Wikipedia, it polices itself pretty well. All the medical elements are written by retired doctors. Is there not a case for individual countries seeking to recruit some volunteers to give additional help in policing this very hydra-headed world of threat that we're facing, focusing on some aspects, not perhaps the state ones, but the criminal ones or others of the kind? Thank you.
There's about 3 questions there, but
yes,
they form a very good sequence.
Questions, but also excellent comments and ideas, and I think that is very much part of the toolkit and what I would put under, in the cyber realm, the government, our government at least, and I believe others are actively hiring white hat hackers, and that technical expertise absolutely is vital. And I believe there are, the private sector is just going to always attract the best and the brightest in that realm. And there's been a concerted, although I would say somewhat patchy, effort to engage Silicon Valley so that our tech talent can be harnessed to this degree. And of course, as you know, Google has dropped out of the Project Maven, and so there are always questions, I think, about how some individuals would prefer not to be associated with a government activity. On the other hand, I think it's very important to continue to try to attract them. There is also a very robust and tradition in some European countries, the Baltics. Now Sweden has a total defense document that is either voluntary, and I think for the U.S. it would certainly have to be a voluntary type of neighborhood watch, civil defense, local defense, and I think that's very important. And as I mentioned, I think it's absolutely important that people defend the freedom of the press, which frankly has come in for quite a drubbing, and I think that the standards published and adhered to, and the willingness to publish corrections when they get it wrong. I mean, I think this is just very important for people in the practice of journalism and those benefiting to defend it.
More questions at the back?
Hi, Adam. I work for the Bank of China in legal and compliance. A lot of emphasis recently in the bank has been incorporating AI technologies and machine learning. What do you think the relationship is in the future with political warfare and the use of AI?
I've got a thought.
Yes.
Shall I kick off?
Go ahead, yes.
Well, for many malign actors, finance is like logistics. It buys you stuff, it buys you access, it enables you to pay the salaries of your malign actors. In fact, there's quite a lot of evidence of how Iran used money to assist the special groups who were attacking US and UK soldiers in Iraq in the previous decade, including, believe it or not, a captured account book from an Iranian-sponsored Iraqi terrorist group that showed how they accounted for the money spent right down to the nearest dollar. So I think follow the money is really important, and what this means is you need more than just conventional intelligence people or conventional military intelligence people. You need to co-opt treasury departments and organisations that find themselves unwittingly handling sums of black money that are being used to help malign political warfare. Probably need to have an uncomfortable but a very private conversation with intelligence and law enforcement agencies.
So clearly governments are making use of the same techniques that the private sector is in terms of both financial and informational flows. And I'm a little bit of an Eeyore on the promise of AI. I think there's a lot of gauzy thinking right now about what AI can do, and it certainly can speed repeatable processes, but it doesn't substitute for the human. I think the question at this stage is really how to efficiently combine what can be done with AI with what the humans can do, and we're experimenting with some of that, but I think it's in a huge growth area, and will absolutely, governments have to stay on top of it, or the criminal underworld can become smarter than the government, and that's the race ahead of us.
More questions? Josh, again.
So apologies for a second go back. The issue of it being a covert activity and the extent to which this is the sort of activity that can be debated in public is something that's always sort of troubled in this country anyway. And we've always avoided an overt debate about it. But the point you make about bringing in civic society and that ability to coordinate would surely be assisted if you had a more public debate about it and actually have a discussion about whether political warfare is the appropriate term, and that we should be thinking much more carefully about how we bring in, civil society into this discussion. If you look at an activity during the Cold War, which arguably made a significant contribution to ending the Cold War, was the Helsinki Accords. Now you could, in the terminology you've got here, you could see the Helsinki Accords as part of a political warfare. And if you look at the Russian response to the Helsinki Accords, they see it as an overtly hostile act. To us, we would see that as normal political discourse. So how do you manage that process of presenting it as a legitimate and proper, morally upright part of state activity?
This is a great note to end on, I think, because after we were asked to do this study using the Kennan term political warfare, and because of that we titled the study Modern Political Warfare. And I actually think to gain it's important for people to understand there is aggression occurring and it requires a response, but it's really about conducting warfare in return. It's about conducting defensive activities and the needed measures to combat it. So I think that I don't like the gray zone term. I think that defines a space, not an approach. I think we're really still in need of the right proactive term, and so I fill up my inbox with ideas. We're actually going to be doing a lexicon, small study, small term, sweep up all these terms and have a big debate and try to come up with the right one and then propagate it. But I think the ideas behind the term are important. And with regard to covert action, and I'll split it into two things. Covert action meaning what you think of, sort of in the sneaky, behind the scenes intel or special operations. These are governed in our country by a law and that requires a presidential finding, and that finding is briefed to the heads of the Intelligence Committee, the Democrat and Republican, and the two leaders of the two houses. So there is a method for this, and they're supposed to report to those, so it's secret, but it's not unbounded. And also we have, for example, since the Church and Pike committees, a ban on political assassination. So these are all guideposts and ways to bound that when secret activity of that type is needed. The other one, of course, is black propaganda, and I think this is something where the community is struggling with because they feel a need to come out into the information space and be more proactive. There is a legal prohibition against propagandizing the home audience, and against black propaganda. And of course, once you emit a message, a false message abroad, our open information space, really, it's pretty hard to bound that. So I think there are difficulties in the propaganda sphere. And we've done some of my colleagues have done some thoughtful studies on that. And Ben probably has a few choice words on that topic too. But it's very important, I think, to really walk carefully into that space to make sure, A, that it's needed, B, that it has some oversight, and C, that it achieves the effects you are after.
I think I'd add, some of the things you might do, where you might use intelligence agencies with or without support from the military, they do carry with them quite a considerable degree of risk. And the risk could come home. You might see SAS troopers and some intelligence agencies strung up in a local marketplace. And so in the UK and the US, you've got very different political mechanisms. Linda's described the US one very well. In the UK, you've got ministerial responsibility, and I think, right across the political spectrum, people like foreign secretaries and defence secretaries will be thinking very, very hard when they sign off on these particular operations. There's no doubt that that at times this has been a real hard core part of US strategy. For example, President Reagan's strategy included what you would now call proxy warfare in contested areas in the third world, where he wanted to contest Russian influence. Well, actually, almost all of that was eventually rumbled. And there are exposures by newspapers, there are congressional hearings, and it does still affect political practice in the United States. It may be that the current information environment makes that much more difficult. I mean, one organisation I've been watching quite carefully is Bellingcat, this self-organising group of bloggers, who, given what the UK had said in public about the GRU officers in Salisbury, actually using open source information, were quite considerably able to flesh out the background, I suspect, to the general discomfort of the leadership of the GRU. And that, I think, is going to be another difficult consideration. So I think what Linda's really shown us is that you can identify the problem, and that work that George Kennan did all those years ago still provides a very good way of seeing the problem. Of course, every problem is different, and you don't want to try and shackle yourself in by terminology. And some of this is politically quite easy, but some of it politically, militarily, and economically and financially is really difficult stuff. But my sense is that in the governments of the United States and its allies, in the defence, security and intelligence community, they've really got to close with these difficult issues. And on that note, would you join me in thanking Linda for an excellent morning?
Thank you very much.